The election of the People's Party government in the 1970s represents a very, very strong break from the past. Well, first of all, if we're talking about breaks, the biggest break, of course, is the fact that Pakistan itself is broken. East Pakistan becomes Bangladesh. And that we have always underestimated. The economic importance of that, I think maybe perhaps the political importance of that we've understood, but the economic importance of that we've always underestimated. Secondly, this is the first time in Pakistan's history that you now have an elected prime minister. Previously, you have civilian prime ministers, but they are not elected via a mass vote in the same way. And of course, the public of Pakistan ends up electing very, very left-wing leaders, both in East Pakistan as well as in West Pakistan. In East Pakistan also, by the way, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman's program is very, very, very similar to Bhutto's program. He's also claiming that he's a socialist, that he's going to nationalize property, and he did when he came to power. Immediately after he came to power, he's going to do land reforms and nationalization, etc., and roti kapda makan, etc. And by the way, even Indira Gandhi is making the same claims in India, etc. So this is a left-wing wave across the world, which is, also obviously has its impact on Pakistan. And last but not least, Bhutto also decides that he's going to have a non-aligned foreign policy. He's not going to do the bidding of the United States and the United Kingdom, of the formal colonial powers, as Pakistan had been doing previously. So here's an estimate of how important East Pakistan really was to West Pakistan. 50% of West Pakistan's products found their way into East Pakistan in 1969-70. 50% of everything produced in West Pakistan was being sold actually in East Pakistan. So important. And 18% of West imports came from East Pakistan. So we had nearly imported a quarter of our imports. Sorry, not a quarter, rather a fifth of our imports, nearly a fifth of our imports were coming from East Pakistan. So this is, economically we were, in our perception maybe we're not so integrated because they're over there, tum udhar or hum idhar. But in economic terms, actually the integration is present and it will have an impact on Pakistan as well as Bangladesh's economic future. Overall growth statistics, let's look at them. I'm sure you find statistics gross, but gross statistics means overall statistics here. So what's happening with GDP? In 71-72, we have a really bad situation mainly because you have civil war. So 1.2% only. But it jumps back very quickly to 7.2%, which is fantastic. And then goes all the way up to 7.7%. So the first 2 years of Bhutto's government, in fact, are actually really quite spectacular. Faster than Ayub Khan. And then suddenly something happens and boom, it comes down to below 4%, 3.9, 3.3, 2.9, averaging out over the entire Bhutto period at 4.4%, which by today's standards, the standards of Naya Pakistan, is still pretty good. So what is going on? What happens over here that causes things to transform so suddenly for Bhutto? Let's have a quick look at his policies first of all. December 71, Bhutto becomes president of Pakistan. January 72, he takes over 31 large firms in 10 basic industries. That includes iron and steel, basic metals, heavy engineering, motor vehicles assembly and manufacture, tractor assembly and manufacture, heavy and basic chemicals, petrochemicals, cement and public utilities. So very early on in Bhutto's time, he takes over these things. March 72, land reforms. March 72 again, management and control of 32 life insurance companies. He takes over the major life insurance companies. No economic downturn. In fact, you have, as I said, 7.7% rate of growth. May 72, major banking reforms. State Bank of Pakistan extends control over scheduled banks, reorienting credit policy towards small farmers and small industrial enterprises. Again, in the same period, 72, he devalues the currency by 131%, major devaluation. And of course, this devaluation has a very big impact on the industrialists because previously under Ayub, they had this system whereby they had this guaranteed, differentiated exchange rate, etc., and guaranteed sort of profit. So that is all finished. Export bonus schemes finished. Procurement prices for agriculture are raised. That is, that the state is now buying from ordinary peasants at a much higher rate. So the bias towards industry and against agriculture, resources are moving from agriculture into industry. Bhutto is reversing that, saying, no, we have to also invest in agriculture. Comprehensive labor reforms in June 72, basically giving a lot of trade unions, etc., rights and collective bargaining authority, education, cess, etc., many of these things. Comprehensive public health program, that's basically his promise to provide sehat to everybody, health facilities to everybody. Nationalization of educational institutions in September 1972. This includes things like FC College, etc. Many major institutes are taken under the government. They are no longer private. I think convent also, if I'm not mistaken. Trade in cotton and rice is nationalized in 73. Now, by September 73, vegetable oil, petroleum marketing and shipping is nationalized. This is when Ardeshir Kawisji loses his big shipping, industry, etc. That was the only one there, etc. Nationalization of all private and domestically owned banks in 74. And then in 76, cotton ginning and husking and flour milling nationalized. These are actually smaller enterprises that were nationalized, and many people thought this was perhaps not a good idea to nationalize them. But he basically nationalized them because these were causing it to control prices, to control the prices of basic commodities. So that's, in a nutshell, you can see some very serious major reforms between 1972 and 1976, rapidly coming one after the other, very large structural reforms. A lot of people think that this is now moving Pakistan towards socialism. I would argue that it was in fact classic social democracy. These are sort of the things that you see in Scandinavian countries. You see them in Norway and Switzerland, and you see them in France, etc., and many of these highly sort of countries where that have a very strong mixture of state and private enterprise. But as I've stated previously with respect to agriculture, Bhutto didn't want to do away with all private property as Marxists or communists would. And it wasn't the case that he was doing these reforms with the intention of bringing about some sort of a Bolshevik revolution or a Chinese revolution like Mao, though he did like to wear the Mao cap on occasion. But his main model is driven by Scandinavian socialism. And he says this very explicitly in his books, etc. Yes?
The export bonus scheme is actually helping with the increased exports?
It's not necessarily helping with the increased exports. It's ending it is ending the sort of privileged position that a few families had with respect to international trade, because they were the ones that had the licenses. Then they got these bonuses, all of this stuff. So Bhutto ended for those 22, 44 families these special provisions that were really favoring them over other industrialists, right? These were considered by the Bhutto regime as being unfair, as unfairly privileging certain families over other competitors, over their competitors.
Doing that doesn't necessarily increase exports. That's like a different thing.
Yes, I think that's a different thing. Exports increased despite doing this. These families, obviously, or economists that supported the previous Ayub policies, may have argued and did argue that if Bhutto does all of this, etc., that exports will dramatically fall. In fact, they didn't. They rose. They increased by 153% over the previous year. Manufacturing exports grew by 19%, etc. So all of that was going up. Meanwhile, also, public investment is going up dramatically. Investment is what money you put into the economy, the stuff that you invest to grow the economy. If at one time in the EU period, at the start of the Bhutto period, it was only 5% of total investment. By the end of the Bhutto period, it's 75% of total investment. So dramatic turnaround in the model of development itself. Now, Hamza was asking this question, why not involve the state versus the market, etc., right? So basically what's happening over here is a dramatic change from market to state-driven investment. Yes? So what is it that happens in 1973-74? OPEC. This is the major thing. And this is, on a global scale, the fastest transfer of wealth from one part of the globe to another part of the globe. Before 1973, nobody wanted to go and live in Saudi Arabia or Dubai or UAE or any of these, or Abu Dhabi or whatever. These were, agricultural societies, relatively speaking, quite poor. Yes, there were affluent families, etc. But overall, these countries, they had no major opportunities for people from other parts of the world. 73, OPEC decides to raise oil prices. And as it raises, and the oil prices have a very low elasticity of demand. You raise the oil prices, people still have to buy that damn oil. No matter how high you make them, they're still buying the same amount of oil. Because otherwise, and this actually happened, cars start lining up on petrol stations waiting for fuel, saying, give us fuel, etc. And this happened when OPEC did this. You can see the pictures if you go to Google. You can see in the US as well as less in the US because US has its own oil production. But in the UK, cars started lining up, down the road from petrol stations because there was no petrol to be had because petrol prices had gone up. Same thing happens to Pakistan. Petrol prices go from 60 million to 225 million. That's the bill that you have to pay to keep the economy going. And if you don't import these, oil, crude oil, petroleum, etc., all of these things, the economy is going to come to a standstill, frankly. So you've got to do it. And similarly, fertilizer, which we were also importing, the bill goes from 40 million to 150 million, jumps up rapidly. So, and in 1976, then you had massive floods that really have a very bad impact on agriculture. In 1974, you have pest attacks, so one bad luck thing after another. You can see the impact here when you look at inflation rates. You see that Pakistan is doing all right, and then suddenly you see 30% inflation almost, 26%, 11%, then it comes back down. It settles back down. And it's really going to settle down when, Bhutto basically imposes certain controls on basic commodities, etc., rice husking and wheat and rice, etc. So you see this whole period of inflation is essentially cost push inflation. OPEC prices are going up, supplies are going up, so you get this sort of inflation. OPEC oil prices change also has a huge impact, obviously would have had a huge impact on balance of trade. So you see over here, in 1971, we're not doing too well. Even in 1970, 71, we're not doing too well because we're at war, etc. But then we begin to balance out. We're doing all right, but boom, then minus 1,000, massive balance of payment deficit. And we can't seem to get out of that balance of trade deficit. Public sector now comes to dominate. Here is a very good graph, very good sort of table to look at public versus private sector investment. You can see at 1970 to 71, public sector is only 5.3% of total investment, right? This is private sector investment, public sector investment, the total investment, relative share of the public sector. It goes from 5 all the way up when Bhutto is overthrown to 75%. In fact, here's the other interesting thing. It doesn't go down after Bhutto is overthrown. It in fact continues to go up 79, 80.9%, then 75%, etc., etc. It's only a little later that in fact it does go down, but not immediately following Bhutto. So here are some of the factors that drove the economy down. Initial outcome of devaluation is very, very positive. What you pointed out, when he devalues, exports go up, and that's a good thing. Floods hit in 73. There's a 4-fold increase in petroleum prices. Import costs much more, prices of fertilizer rise, essential imports, oil jumps, etc. And there is excessive inflation, not just in Pakistan, pretty much everywhere in the world. World recession follows after OPEC does this. The whole global political economy undergoes a change. And demand for Pakistan's export remains severely depressed and affects industrial output. Balance of trade gets bhi kharab ho jati. There's a huge failure of crops by as much as 1/4. And this was a time when if there was not a failure of crops, owing to pest attack, etc., that actually Pakistan could have made quite a bit of money selling its crops. But just when we could have made the money selling the crops, pests came and destroyed. And by the way, you could do an interesting study to see whether this disaster was itself the cause of the Green Revolution in the sense of the monocropping economy, lack of biodiversity, etc. It can cause massive dips in agriculture when you have monocropping, cash cropping, etc. And then when you recovered from that, you had floods. So that also destroyed quite a bit.